Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're on to the front axle on the Tamiya Scania 770S. We're up to bag B, which of course has all the front axle bits and the nuts and the bolts. Now we're not quite going to be following the kit build, instead we've got an aftermarket front axle and drag link. I'm not sure of the brand as I have had it for quite some time. However, if you search AliExpress or eBay and the like, they are fairly common. Unlike the Tamiya axle, the knuckles are metal and the steering is fully ball raced. It should help with our quest to reduce the steering slop as much as we can. Plus, while we're improving the steering, we're also going to flip the axle around to correct the Ackerman. Usually with the Tamiya setup on the Euro trucks, the outside wheel turns more than the inside, which is a bit of a compromise setup. Essentially, we just need to flip the axle round, but that does create some clearance issues with the gearbox, and it does make the linkage quite interesting to work out. Right, bag B and step 8, mounting the springs to the axle and building the dampers. We need 2 M3x6s, 8 M3 nylock nuts, 6 3mm O-rings, 4 U-bolts, 2 spring seats, 6 damper shafts, 6 damper bodies, which we'll keep in the tub so they don't keep rolling away, 2 damper mounts and 2 damper springs. And then for plastic there's 6 F3 rod ends. We'll start with the dampers just to get them out of the way. All 6 are exactly the same except the front 2 have the springs installed. So to build one, all we need to do first is unscrew the cap. Then we can add some grease to a damper shaft, slide on an O-ring, add a bit more grease under the O-ring, pop the shaft into the damper body and press it home with a screwdriver. Don't use too much force though, you just need to wobble it a bit to get the end of the shaft to line up with the hole. Then with the screwdriver again, we can thread on a rod end. Rinse and repeat 5 more times, so we've got a set of 6. For the rear 4, we just need to thread the cap back on and nip them up. For the front 2, we need to pop a spring in before we can fit the cap. Watch out though, if you're not quite lined up, the springs do like to jump out. The dampers can now go off to one side. The 2 of the springs get used in the next step, but the rear ones won't get used for a little while. Now, unlike the Tamiya axles, this one's already loaded with its knuckles and the drag link. If you're building stock, it's still quite simple though. The knuckles are attached with a couple of kingpins and E-clips. The axle has a pair of threaded holes on one side of the blocks at the end of the straight bit. These are where the damper mounts mount, and they need to be on the right side. The assembly without the knuckles can fit either way, so no biggie, but if you've got the axles with them already fitted, it's good to get them right first time. Having said that, worst case, you'll just need to swap the knuckles around in the next step. To fit the springs, we pop a spring seat onto the axle. Then on the other side we fit a spring, and then the tricky bit is fitting the U-bolts. We need to keep the springs and seats in position while threading the U-bolts into the seats. We can fit the 4 nylock nuts. Now initially we just want them up to the nylon locking bit in the nut, so they're all nice and even. Then we use a cross wrench to tighten the nuts a little bit at a time. We want to try and keep them fairly even as they go down. Until the axle gets hung on the chassis, we need to set the nuts so the leaf springs can still move on the axle. We'll tighten the nuts up once the springs have found where they want to go. If you tighten them up now, there's a good chance the suspension will be quite stiff as the springs will pinch the mounts on the chassis. The other spring is of course exactly the same: spring seat, spring, 2 U-bolts and 4 nuts. For the damper mounts, we need to add a little bit of thread lock in the threaded holes in the blocks on the axle. Then we just offer the mounts up with an M3x6 and tighten them up. Try and set them so they're nice and straight, otherwise they can force a bit of a twist on the leaf springs. Okay, step 9, hanging the axle. We need 2 M3x15s, 6 M3x14 step screws, 6 M3 nylock nuts, 2 M3 flange nuts, 2 damper collars, and then there's the axle, the front dampers, and when we get to it we will of course need the chassis. First, I did indeed have the knuckles facing the wrong way on the axle, so we need to remove the pins and swap them round. Unlike the Tamiya axle, this one uses nuts rather than the E-clips, so it's nice and straightforward. The drag link comes off first, then we remove the pins, being very careful not to lose the small bearings. They do have a tendency to roll away if they land on their side. Now I'm not going to refit the drag link just yet. It'll be a bit less to get in the way while we're hanging the axle. We'll refit it once everything else is in place. To fit the axle, we offer it up to the shackles on the chassis and we pop in the first step screw. Go around all four and initially thread on the nuts just a few turns to stop the screws falling out. Then go with the cross wrench and bottom out all the nuts on the threads. There should be enough clearance that the leaves will still be a bit loose in the shackles. If they're tight, you've probably got one of the plates pinched. Work the axles a bit and it should right itself. Then you can nip up the nut properly. Next, make sure the leaf springs are still a little bit loose where they're mounted to the axle. Work the suspension up and down a bit, and then a little bit at a time, tighten the nuts, keeping them nice and even. They should fully tighten right up to the end of the threads. You should find the axles will move very smoothly up and down without binding. If it's still a bit grabby, loosen the nuts again, work the suspension, and try and line up the springs. To mount the dampers, we just need to pop a collar onto the top of the damper, slide in one of the screws from the small end, offer it up to the tower and fit a nut on the back. But since these are going to be quite buried, we're going to use a bit of thread lock to make sure they don't come loose. The nuts are a bit of a pain to get to once the rest of the structure is on the front of the chassis. At the bottom, we just slide the rod end into the lower mount and pop in a step screw. Then lastly, fit a nylock nut. Same on the other side, and that's step 9 complete. Step 10, knuckles and linkages. Now this is where things need some mods to work. Also, since we've got the knuckles from the axle already fitted, we don't need any of the Tamiya parts. What we do need though is our aftermarket drag link with its bushings and screws. It just mounts under the knuckles in either the inner or the outer hole. Which one we use in the end depends a bit on the gearbox clearance. For now, it doesn't really matter. Next, we have the short linkage that goes between the bottom arm on the bell crank and the knuckle. Now, we flip the axle round to get the correct Ackerman angle, so there's nowhere to mount the linkage. Now, we've got aluminium knuckles, so we can happily drill an extra hole for the rod end to mount. So we need to remove the knuckle on the crank side so we can work out where to drill the new hole. Now it wants to be roughly the same distance from the kingpin as the hole on the straight side. It's not too critical, we just need to make sure that at full turn there's enough space for the rod end. And here we are a little bit later. I also flattened out the web and drilled and tapped an M3 hole. You can do something similar with the stock knuckles, but remember they are plastic and the hole will weaken them quite substantially. Now, before we refit the knuckle, we can fit the short linkage. Remember we're using RC four-wheel drive rod ends, so we use M3 screws rather than the stock Tamiya ball ends. Next, the knuckle can get refitted to the axle. The drag link needs to be attached to the knuckle too, and after a little bit of adjustment in the linkage lengths, that should be a working setup. We can hook up the servo tester and see how it goes. And well, I think it's looking pretty good. The inside wheel is now turning more than the outside, which is ideal, but the drag link is catching the leaf spring at full turn. For now, I've just added a 3mm spacer under the drag link bushing, which has done the trick. However, a little bit into the future, bit of future info, I've had to add another 10mm of spacer for a total of 13mm to clear the bottom of the gearbox. Not a problem with metal knuckles, but with the plastic ones you might get a bit of unwanted flex. There's one more quick thing I'm going to do before we pack up bag B. I'm going to remove the servo arm and drill and tap an extra hole a bit further into something a bit more reasonable. It's still a bit of a guess, but hopefully it'll clear the plastic parts that get mounted around the servo later in the build. If not, I've always got a few more spare arms, so we can measure up properly when all the bits are mounted. Either way, we can set the servo tester to sweep end to end and see our custom system working in all its glory. There's very little slop in the system, so it should work a treat. Plus, it'll turn quite a bit tighter than the Tamiya setup, so getting around the tight corners on the layout should be an absolute breeze. Right, for this week then, that's going to be it. So as always, thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys.